That was the book thief.
What's that?
There was a book, I think it was about the Holocaust. The book thief.
What's the book thief?
No, it's not a Buddhist book, but it's a really good book. And I saw part of the movie. It was an Oscar movie.
Oh. A little bit and then talk. This will be a little different. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
No, I got, well, kind of fantasy. Fantasy money just goes in the beginning. I am. Week 13 is going to be rough because the Ravens players and the Bills players on bye. I got to substitute them.
Yeah, she's about to correct it. Right. she cut and pasted and forgot to change the date. So she just said to me tonight, "Oh, I got it."
Still excited.
Yeah.
She's going to do a Zoom teaching.
Week from Sunday. Kempo. Yeah. Oh. Thank you. All right. Good evening, everyone. New book. Michael Carruthers' Buddha. A very short introduction. But I like this little book. It was published in 1983. And I think the Dalai Lama won the Nobel Peace Prize.
I think they made it even shorter, by making the font so small that you can hardly read it.
Oh, same length book, just fewer pages. All right. But I think the Dalai Lama, if I correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was 1982 or 83 that he won the Nobel Peace Prize. So this book is from that time, and Carruthers, I think, is a professor somewhere in England, and I don't know if he's done anything since. I haven't followed it. Oh,
Sorry to interrupt. We just joined the meeting. Could you give us the name of the book and the author again?
Oh, yes. It's Buddha, a very short introduction by Michael Carruthers.
Michael Carruthers. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
All right, Gretchen's saying that she sent out an email. Was it, Gretchen? Yeah, just this afternoon. That has a link to a online PDF kind of version too.
Yeah. Okay, I don't know if I received that email. I didn't see it in my. I'll check my other accounts.
We'll check tonight too to see if it went to you.
Perfect.
But I like this little book because it's I think it's helpful for us Westerners especially because it's like the historical story, what we know from an academic point of view, and yeah, I just think the Buddha's story is very helpful for building our own kind of confidence and faith, but also knowing the struggles that he went through and the history of it. Because that's really remarkable. You know, you think about all the scandals with kind of like self-created, self-recognized religious types. It's amazing, 45 years. And of course, what has come from that. It's just such a down-to-earth kind of example. So I like it very much. Just for my own kind of, confidence. And also when you talk to other people, Because you know how it is if it's family member or someone who has an even a really a sincere interest, but you just sort of can't start talking about Vajrayogini. It just doesn't work that way. And the terminology in that, I mean, I'm always in danger, a fault of that, of sort of speaking of, because you get involved in this, and then after years and years, it becomes, at least the terminology becomes more familiar. But then you have some poor person who's walked in here for the first time, and they often have no idea what's being spoken of. But there too, that's not really a problem, because people, if they come in and they feel kind of a spaciousness, and they feel that no one's trying to sell them anything, and they may have no idea what's going on, but at the same time, they're here for a deeper reason that they may not, probably don't recognize. At least that's been my experience with myself. You think you have it all figured out, you don't. This stuff is deep. So, but I like the fact that this is kind of a modern secular kind of exposition of the Buddha's life and history, which I think is very helpful in talking to folks. So I wanted to first just read this little preface and then part of the introduction, and we'll talk a little bit. So this is the preface from the book. He says, until the last century, and again, this is written in 1983, so he's saying until 1900, the Buddha was probably the most influential thinker in human history. I mean, what a thing to say. His teaching prospered throughout the subcontinent of India for more than 1,500 years. And in that time, it changed and diversified at least as much as Christianity did in its first 1,500 years in Europe. By the 13th century of the modern era, when the power of Buddhism was broken in its original home, India, it had long since spread to Tibet, Central Asia, China, Korea, Japan, and Sri Lanka, and was making its way into Southeast Asia. Buddhism's history in those countries was as complicated as it had already been in India. I have not attempted to explain such a vast matter in this short book. I have only recounted the life of the Buddha and described the genesis and significance of his teaching. I have tried, however, to phrase this account so the reader will be able to see why Buddhism moved so easily across continents and survived so well through the centuries. That's an amazing thought, too. I've been happy to have certain kind of contacts with the Indian community in Rochester. First through interfaith things, but then through some sort of shared activities. And we were invited, for instance, once. India has a roaming ambassador. It's a position where they get an ambassador to the United States, the United Kingdom, like everybody else does, but they also have someone who is a roving ambassador who oversees Indian ethnic communities. A very interesting man, and he came on one of his tours once to the I can't remember what it's called. What do they call the Hindu center out? No, you're thinking in a religious way. I'm thinking of the one that's out in for the whole community, which is more like a culture. Indian Community Center. Thank you. Very esoteric name. See, you're too intelligent, Ben. You're too plugged in. Yeah, the Indian Community Center. And, he was talking, and he was giving kind of a pep talk. He was reminding the Indians that they had invented the zero in computations. And of course, that's related to emptiness. It's very fascinating. And anyway, there was a question and answer kind of thing, and I shot off my mouth because at the time I was trying to promote the Kala Chakra event we had, so people were thinking about Buddhism. And I mentioned that, Indian, if you talk to the Dalai Lama, he will tell you he's teaching things that they inherited from India. And it's been very fascinating here. Sometimes we'll have people from the Indian Community Center occasionally come in, and it's remarkable because our 7 bowls on the altar, the Arghya, Padya, Pushpa, Dupe, those are, of course, the name of Sanskrit goddesses. So representing, what those different offerings are. And of course, the Indians who come in, Hindus recognize that. They, oh, yeah. And there's this interesting step, though, because I often found it's like if you have a secular person, like a modern agnostic or atheist, come in, and they see all of this, and it seems wildly too religious. Why do you have any kind of statues? Why do you have these pictures on the wall? Why is somebody lighting incense? What are you making offerings to? It's too religious. But sometimes for the theistic types, certainly like Christians, it's not religious enough because Buddha's not a creator God. And they want it to be more like that, more this kind of distance between the creatures and creator. You just can't go there. I've been reading some stuff recently, interviews with people who are converts to Eastern Orthodoxy. And I'm finding it very fascinating because, this religious, and even in English, the word religious misleads us often. Because I had an interaction with a Western Buddhist a couple of weeks ago, and she had such a certain kind of Christian upbringing, and had a very negative reaction to it. And so religion's like a bad word with her. And so she practices Western Zen, but she quoted favorably Mao's statement that religion is poison. And of course, we got that from the Dalai Lama because he went to Beijing and Peiping at that time and tried to get the Chinese to ease off a little bit after they first took over Tibet. And that's what Mao said. So that comes from the Dalai Lama. And I just thought it's so strange because here you go. You got a choice between the Dalai Lama and Mao, and somehow you give credence to Mao. Why? Just simply over a word. Because she has this image of, religion as being something that is oppressive, something that is fundamentally anti-rational. Yeah, he's just suppressing. Right. But this is what I'm saying is the word religion sometimes misleads us all, because Buddhism doesn't really talk about religion per se. The lamas will say that speaking in English. But, the actual word there isn't a word for Buddhist in Tibetan. It's an inner follower, one who follows the inner path. So it lacks all that sectarian kind of baggage that comes with our experience of quote unquote religions. But often, not religious enough, too religious. And the Buddha called his own teachings the middle way. And what it comes down to is, view with a capital V. Because in the sense that the Buddhists talk about religion, everybody's religious. This Protestant theologian, Paul Tillich, who was, big like 50 years ago, I'm so dated, I can't believe it, talked about ultimate concern. And so it's more like that, ultimate concern in an emotional way. But for the Buddhists, what's your view? Because the mind creates what is your view. If you have a limited mind, you're going to get a limited result. And of course, different levels of subtlety and depth. But nonetheless, this statement here in the preface that why Buddhism moves so easily across continents and survives so well through the centuries. So obviously there are a lot of things in Buddhism and Hinduism that are obviously very, very similar. The understanding and the conviction that kind of like knowledge that comes from an inner looking is valid and is actually the path to what everybody is seeking. So that, they have some subtle differences, but generally for us, we don't even have to worry about that. But what I think is interesting, and especially when I saw this ambassador going around the distant Indian communities, is how Buddhism has been so easily able to go to cultures that are radically different from India. And India has made some inroads in the British Empire, basically. And I wonder if that has something to do because Sanskrit is an Indo-European language. So therefore, it's like we do Amitabha Vajrasattva, we tend to the Sanskrit names rather than the Tibetans. I think there are linguistic reasons for that. At least you can say it, but it's interesting to me that Buddhism has gone to places that are completely different, such as China and Japan and Southeast Asia, and certainly Tibet and Central Asia, and it had some inroads in Persia and Afghanistan too. So wildly different cultures have still somehow been able to absorb these teachings, whereas you don't see, like Ganesh going everywhere. That's something, and Buddhism has its wild images too, as we all know, but somehow it gets presented in a way that doesn't seem to be as completely off-putting as a god who has the head of an elephant. Not that there's anything wrong with it, not at all. It's profound, it's just profound teachings there, but that's kind of a barrier, I think. Nonetheless, so the story that he's talking about here is very much, the classical self-liberation Buddhism, and that's why I think it's valuable. Okay. Then I also wanted to point out, those of you that have the book, is this nifty map right inside the preface. This is very helpful because you see where the Buddha's 45 years of activity were. And this is Greater India. So there's northern, in Kapilavastu, where he was born, and Kushinagar, where he passed away. Those are now, no, Kushinagar isn't, but Kapilavastu and Lumbini, where he was born, are both in Nepal. So this map includes Nepal, just the India of his time. But again, helpful. Okay, a little bit from the introduction, because I found this very helpful too. Among the ruins of Anuradhapura, the ancient capital of Sri Lanka, there rests alone on a pedestal above the grass a seated image of the Buddha in stone, slightly larger than life. The statue is conventional, probably more than 1,000 years old, of a type found throughout Buddhist Asia. The legs are folded in meditation, the hands laid one upon the other in the lap. Buddhists hold that it was in this posture, seated beneath a tree more than 2,500 years ago, that the Buddha was awakened, attaining decisive knowledge of the human condition and the unshakable certainty that he was released from its suffering. So that's a wonderful statement, what this author's saying he accomplished. And it's the kind of thing that sort of is easy for people that you meet to understand. This decisive knowledge of the human condition and unshakable certainty that he was released from its suffering. In its excellence, however, the Anuradhapura image is far from conventional. The back and head are disciplined and upright, but the arms are relaxed and the face reposes in tranquility. The figure seems intelligent and serene, wed perfectly to the unmoving granite. Standing before it, an elderly English socialist told me that in the whole mess of human history, this, at least, the statue and all it stands for, was something of which we could be proud. He said that he had no use for religion, but that he felt he had unknowingly been a follower of the Buddha all along. So that's a remarkable thing. And, you get to a point where somebody else's opinion doesn't matter. But at the same time, this is very helpful for people to understand. And it reflects, it's just about reality, in my opinion. But this middle way teaching is so helpful because it allows you to talk to the agnostic. It allows you to talk to the very religious person. It's said that this famous, we talk about Mahamudra and the the classical way that it was taught. Say Milarepa's example. You have a student, a lama, a realized lama, and then really a community of practitioners around, living in their own huts, getting together for food, whatever, sometimes supported by a nearby town. But the student comes to the teacher, and the teacher poses questions about the nature of mind to the student and wants a response from the student. And of course, the student response isn't adequate. So maybe the teacher gives them something, he or she something to work on, and they go off, and you can be like in 3 months or something, working alone in meditation until they think they have some sort of answer for the teacher, and then come back. Well, this is what's been sort of rapidly condensed in Lin Chi Buddhism in China, Rinzai, the Zen sect in Japan. This kind of questioning and this one-to-one, knee-to-knee, face-to-face kind of contact with the teacher. It's rarely done anymore because it takes a certain amount of support and whatever. The times are different. I don't know. But one of the famous Japanese koans is called mu, which means no. And this is like the crystallization of this kind of practice, very formalized and ritualized, but at its heart, that's what's going on. And there are different examples. The koans all use examples, historical examples of interchanges between a master and students. And then the challenge for the student is to meditate on that. And what does it really mean? Give a live, realized reaction of that, not just a conceptual thought. And so there's this example of Jashu, is one of the great Chinese Zen masters, was asked by a monk, does a dog have a Buddha nature? And he said no. And he said it very forcefully. And of course, the monk was like undoubtedly kind of filled up with his own intellectual learning. And of course, like all of us would say, oh yes, earthworms have Buddha nature, dogs have. And so he, and he asked this question, which he thought he knew the answer of. And the master just took away his conceptual mind and said no. And this caused a huge problem for this monk. What do you mean no? You've been telling me forever, yes. And so he was meditating on that no until he reached a state eventually of such concentration on it with this doubt. In Zen, they talk about the ball of doubt. You turn your whole mind in a single focused ball of doubt. And then with that kind of samadhi, that is the mind, completely focused, not paying attention to any of the afflictions that are arising, there can be some sort of an insight that happens. But on other occasions, a monk asked Jashu, same different monk, but same teacher, does a dog have the Buddha nature? And he said yes. All of this creates a problem for philosophers, for Western philosophers. You can't. What do you mean? This, that, this. So there we go. It's very much alive. And then here you go, this elderly English socialist in the whole mess of human history. This, at least, the statue and all it stands for, was something of which we could be proud as human beings. He said that he had no use for religion, but that he felt he had unknowingly been a follower of the Buddha all along. It's a wonderful statement. An intensely private reflection to disclose, its disclosure prompted perhaps by the power of the figure. But what is remarkable is that it should be found in so many others. Here, for example, is the anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, by no means a Buddhist, writing in a similar vein. This Lévi-Strauss is one of the great anthropologists of the 20th century. I don't really know much about it, but you see his name pop up by people who seem to know what they're talking about from time to time. But this is from him. What I have learnt from the masters, I have listened to. The philosophers I have read, the stories I have investigated, and that very science in which the West takes such pride. No, I'm doing it wrong. What have I listened? What have I learnt from the masters I have listened to? What have I learnt from the masters that I have listened to? The philosophers I have read, the societies I have investigated, and from that very science in which the West takes such pride. Simply a fragmentary lesson or two, which, if laid end to end, would add up to the meditation of the sage at the foot of his tree. Pretty remarkable. This testifies to the fascination the Buddha still holds for us. Is it justified? What does an Oriental seer, born in the middle of the first millennium before Christ, among historical circumstance and a culture so different from our own, have to offer such a very modern thinker? This is the first question I've tried to answer. And I have tried to answer it by writing a biography of the Buddha. That is a reasonable strategy. That this is a reasonable strategy is by no means obvious, for history is full of figures whose significance lies very little in their personal lives and very much in their teachings alone. But Buddha is peculiar in this regard, for his teaching and his life are intimately and inextricably mingled. And that's a remarkable thing too. But of course, this is the middle way. It's really true. It happens sometimes, like with scientists. You can have a scientist who has really, profound insights, or at least very knowledgeable, deep kind of knowledge, insights into reality in that, but might have a terrible personality. Someone said once that, the mind that's going out and out and out and out can acquire knowledge, but it doesn't transform the personality. It necessarily transform the personality. But what the Buddha discovered is that by going in and in and in and in, the personality is transformed too, because you're getting not just knowledge, but wisdom. There are so many fascinating parallels in the Buddhist sutras, talking about, the infinity of galaxies and things like that. So, the crisis that Christianity went through when Dharma popped up, or the telescope, this has always been kind of a challenge to, traditional Christian organizations and that. But for the Buddhists, they had that vastness, both inner and outer, from the get-go. And so this is, not in a competitive way, but it's very helpful, again, for us talking to whomever. I mean, of course, there's some people that you don't want to talk to. It isn't helpful. It sort of makes an obstacle to them. People has to be a moment when they're open to wanting to hear something. And it isn't just meaning, throwing Dharma teachings at them or anything like that. But I mean, just relating to a person on a one-to-one basis. That sometimes speaks the Dharma truly much louder than any kind of words we might come up with. We've all had the experience when you even seem to have some sort of rapport with someone. And again, not thinking of trying to convince anybody of anything or even sharing religious thoughts, but you just have a true moment when, you think you're in the same wavelength with somebody. It could be about anything, it could be about football or dog raising, who knows? And so you offer an opinion, and then they can come back with something that shows that they're just on a completely different planet. We're always misperceiving in this way. It's the nature of things. But what I take from these is this, the wisdom of these teachings, because they're not conceptual ultimately. And yet the conceptual teachings are a manifestation of this realization of reality, racially. The thing as it is. Okay. All right. Any questions or anything on that? Well, we're going to continue into the brief biography. Okay. A brief biography. Let me illustrate this from traditional accounts of the Buddha's life, which have exerted tremendous influence over Buddhists and are now widely available in European language. The Buddha was born the son of a king, and so grew up with wealth, pleasure, and the prospect of power, all goods commonly desired by human beings. As he reached manhood, however, he was confronted with a sick man, an old man, and a corpse. He had lived a sheltered life, and these affected him profoundly, for he realized that no wealth or power could prevent him too from experiencing illness, old age, and death. He also saw a wandering ascetic bent on escaping these sufferings. Reflecting on what he had seen, he reached the first great turning point of his life. Against the wishes of his family, he renounced home, wife, child, and position to become a homeless wanderer, seeking release from this apparently inevitable pain. For some years, he practiced the trance-like meditation and later the strenuous self-mortification, which were then current among such wanderers, but he found these ineffective. So he sat down to reflect quietly, with neither psychic nor physical rigors, on the common human plight. This led to the second great change of his life, for out of this reflection and tranquility arose at last awakening and release. He had done what was to be done. He had solved the enigma of suffering. Deriving his philosophy from his experience, he then taught for 45 years, and his teaching touched most problems in the conduct of human life. He founded an order of monks who were to free themselves by following his example, and they spread his teachings abroad in the world. He eventually died of mortal causes like others, but unlike others, he was utterly extinguished. So that's parinirvana, but they have the Pali here, parinabuto. I don't know, familiar with Pali. For he would never be reborn to suffer again. Okay, so that's the basic story that we all know. There are good, yeah.
How do they?
Oh, right. We got you on Zoom. He's going to give you the mic. We don't identify the questioner, don't worry.
I was just wondering how they can know for sure that he's not going to be coming back to suffer.
He's speaking what the Buddhist belief is.
Okay.
So he's not talking like Michael Carruthers, scientist.
Okay.
He's saying this is what the story is. He's going to talk a little bit about the story coming up here too.
Did the Buddha say that he's not going to come back in his teachings?
It's a good question for Kempo, because I asked Lama Tarchin once, I said, we've got this story of the Buddha taking 3 eons practicing bodhicitta, and then in this last lifetime, through the struggle and the searching and everything, then coming to full realization. But you told me this other story too, where the Buddha was enlightened from the beginninglessness, and this whole thing was just a display to help sentient beings. So which is it? Lama Tarchin said both, with a big grin on his face. So it's both. I mean, he's beyond suffering, and yet at the same time, the teaching is that the Dharmakaya, Sambhogakaya, Nirmanakaya are effortless manifestations for the benefit of beings. And there's something else called the Svabhavivakaya, which is the essence kaya, which is the 3 together. It's the awareness of those 3 aspects of Buddha mind, because you really can't divide them at all. So yes, for the self-liberation teachings, the Buddha attained to parinirvana and is gone. He's not come back anymore. And there won't be any more Buddhas until Maitreya shows up like 5,000 years from now. The Buddha of the future.
Oh.
And all of us can come to our hot ship so we can get completely beyond suffering, but we don't really become Buddhas. That's the basic self-liberation teaching. The Mahayana goes further and says, actually, we can all come to Buddhahood, and that we will do this continuous manifestation because of this great training in loving kindness and compassion, and beyond that, bodhicitta. You're just training the mind in that way. It leads to enlightenment, but of course the power of that is that's what it is. That is Buddha nature. So there's never forgetting of sentient beings, even though it's said that for the great bodhisattva, to see the suffering of sentient beings is like a mother watching her young child having a nightmare, thrashing around, going through. Mother knows exactly what's going on, can't really do anything for the child except just wake it up. So that suffering is totally real for the child, but it's not real for the bodhisattva at all. So yeah, it gets very heady and very subtle. And when they put the words, the experience into words, and how do you teach this in a way that can be transmitted, educated and transmitted to like a crowd, a society? I think sometimes, I mean, what if you and I were sitting right now, in the middle of a jungle in India under a tree, and suddenly you come to omniscience? I mean, what do you do? I mean, how do you communicate that to someone? So it's rather remarkable, that Buddhism has even survived in this way, and also survived without becoming fundamentally corrupted. I mean, anybody can corrupt anything, but at the same time, you read Milarepa's teachings, it's just what Khenpo's talking about here. And you'll see as we read these too in the self-liberation teachings, it's like somehow stayed pure. It's a remarkable achievement. Yeah.
I have one more question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So in Buddhism, there is no creator.
Right.
How is it explained that things happen in a synchronistic way that seem to be creating things?
Yeah, you could say the mind is a creator. There's no being apart from ourselves that is fundamentally apart from us who is creating things. Rather, we're creating all this through our mind. It's all a projection of our mind. It's more than a projection, but I mean, it's so amazing because it turns everything upside down. So no matter how disappointed you are, you've done it to yourself. And of course, that idea of a self is mistaken, actually, but those are very profound insights. But it immediately lessens this, the incredible, like absolute existential pain. I mean, you have suffering happening, and if we're just like there, like naked beings with this stuff falling out of the sky on us, damn, that's a bad situation, When I was younger, I just thought it was just like so completely horrible. It's like nothing you could do. I just thought we were sort of dealt a hand in life, and sometimes it was good, sometimes it was bad, but there was nothing you could do about it fundamentally. All these outer forces. And that's what the Dharma turns around completely, because it's our own seeds that we've planted, and our own conditioning is such that a trigger, a condition causes this inner ignorance to kind of flower, and then we experience. So it's like ripples, there are all the different waves going in different directions on a calm pond. It gets very complicated, and we don't necessarily see this whole network of stuff. But even with the thought that I'm doing this, that somehow I have agency and power, there's something I can do, if simply just in the self-liberation way, not reacting out of my own pain and anger or whatever. That changes the whole picture. And so then the teachings are all just built up to give us more confidence in this, to see that it's actually rational and it's not something like throwing away your mind or something. No, you can figure these things out. So they're all helps. But so nonetheless, we have projected all of this, and the mind is vast. It's more vast than the psychological mind that we all have confidence in. And so we've set up, these pure lands, these galaxies, places to be reborn, because it's simply the quality of our mind it's like we're seeing through a lens, and the quality of that lens conditions what you see. So a very simple example, for instance, is, if we've had lifetimes as a rhinoceros and we're born as a rhinoceros, we're seeing everything through rhinoceros eyes. And so, if you're, a male rhinoceros and you see a female rhinoceros, that looks pretty interesting. But if you're a human being, you see a female rhinoceros, you're going to go the other direction. It's just our baggage that we've kept with us. But in the practice of these things, it's like we make it real and we take it with us. We take it with us when we die. The image that they give is, but it's subtle because it's not like there's some substance there. It's said to be like a candle flame being passed from one candle to the other one. So the second flame, is it different or is it the same? Well, it's neither. It's both the same flame, but it's different at the same time. It's distinct, and yet there's something that's vast about it because it has the nature of a flame. It's not just this little thing burning, but yet it's individual too. We can say, well, it's just that flame. So it's tremendous. It's tremendous. And yet, although nothing is passed over, yet something passed over, kind of the energy of it. Or another example they give is like a seal in hot wax. What passed over? Absolutely nothing. And yet there's this perfect image of what was here. So something distinct passed over, but you can't really put your finger on it. So this is the basic Buddhist insight. When we look inside and try to find something solid, we don't find anything, even what appears to be solid. So hopefully more will come as we read the book.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So that was the basic story, like he said, the brief biography. There are good reasons to doubt even this very compressed account. But at least the outline of the life must be true: birth, maturity, renunciation, search, awakening and liberation, teaching, death. This biography, with the two marked transformations, the renunciation and the awakening, gave the Buddha and his followers the dramatic plot with which to illustrate their belief and the psychological and philosophical model on which to found their thought. Dramatically, the action centers on spiritual changes achieved by heroic personal application, while philosophically, it centers on discoveries made within the Buddha's own mind and body. Hence, he said, "It is within this fathom-long carcass, with its mind and its notions, that I declare there is the world, there is the origin of the world, there is the cessation of the world, and also the path leading to the cessation of the world. Within these bounds, what he suffered was suffered in common with all mortal beings. For all mortals, in his words, birth is suffering, aging is suffering, sickness is suffering. In his view, these inescapable and pressing facts were discoverable by anyone through introspection into their own experience. Similarly, the means of release were available to everyone. The meditation methods which he developed, for example, are based on such simple and available phenomenon as one's own breathing. The morality he espoused was founded in clear and practical principles derived from his own life. The Buddha's laboratory was himself, and he generalized his findings to cover all human beings." He said somewhere that we touch the deathlessness with the body. And again, it's this idea, this image of the middle way comes up again and again and again. Because the body, of course, is the thing that dies. But he said we touch deathlessness with the body. And this is, you can say in one sense, this is, like he's saying here, the great self-reliance that he's teaching. It's all of us have this capacity. All of us can do this. We don't have to go out and get some degree. We don't have to become Elon Musk or something. You don't have to do any of that stuff. The path is there. That's really amazing. But also that this is what human beings share in their deepest essence. We're the same, you might say. And of course, this is the basis for compassion. And again, I think the English language misleads us so much inadvertently, because for us, comes with, in Latin, passion, of course, with passion, with passion, come passion. The ordinary worldly compassion is good. But when the Buddha talks, the Mahayana talks about compassion, it's like it does that compassion, but it goes beyond it to compassion, like I call it with a capital C. In other terms, they sometimes say upaya, which is skillful methods. So it's very active, but also it's just tremendous. The basis of this compassion is recognizing, you might say in a limited way, yourself in other people. This is easy to do, like in maybe one family, something you share, in one ethnicity, in one nation, or one species, whatever you want to do. It gets harder and harder and harder the farther out you go. Because isn't it funny? If you have animals that are very different from us, like a fly, if you have a little speck of fly shit on your hand, it's not such a big deal. You just flick it off, blow it off. It's not really so gross, just a little pebble of sand or something. But the closer you get to being a human being, the grosser it gets. So if you're dealing with cat shit in a box, that's not very pleasant, but you can do it. But the idea of human feces is just beyond what anyone can. So our self is, a very powerful kind of thing. But the Buddha discovered what is common there. And of course, this is one of the immediate practical benefits of meditation, is that you see the games that you're playing with yourself, or the just useless thoughts, and also how the afflictions motivate us. Someone said, for instance, that really in the modern era, really one of the most destructive emotions is envy. There's just so much. If someone has more money than someone else, it's almost like sanctified that it's all right. But it doesn't manifest in an outer way, like pride. People can see pride all the time. Greed, people can see all the time. Lust, all these, the classical seven sins of the Christian world. You can see those things, but envy you can't see. It's like silent. And so it's very destructive. So we live in this kind of pretend that everyone's like in a Budweiser commercial or something, We don't want to look at the negative part, but when you meditate, you can't avoid it. And this is the dawning of wisdom, because you're seeing all the negative things that are there, positives too, but seeing things, the whole picture, instead of just the stuff that kind of makes us look good, or that we want to project to people. One teacher said once that, in the worldly way, we hide our shortcomings and we broadcast our virtues. But the Buddhist way is the opposite. You hide your virtues and you broadcast your shortcomings. This is, the confession ceremony of Asher-sattva. And of course, this is the way that you actually deal with those things. They lose their power because they're not hidden anymore. Anyway. Yeah. Mike, pass the mic.
I'm sorry, I keep forgetting about renunciation and what it is we're renunciating.
Uh-huh. What are you saying? You're forgetting what it is? Is that what
did I say?
Are you asking?
Oh, yes.
What are you asking?
Oh, geez. Yeah, that was what it is.
Yeah, what we're renunciating?
Yes.
What
is renunciation, and what is it that we're renunciating?
Yeah.
I mean, isn't that an integral part of Buddhism?
Absolutely. You can say the start of the path. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And renunciation, again, the English word is a little misleading here, especially in our culture. So nunce is zero in Latin. So sort of doing zero again and again and again is what the literal meaning is. But if you're like me, it's like, you get your mom catches your hand in the cookie jar and you get slapped, get your hand out of there. And we sort of have this culture that, not for everyone, but for many people, it's kind of like, this hurts so much, it must be good for me. Because we have a negative view of ourselves and we think we have to slap that down. But renunciation, I don't know the actual word in Tibetan or Sanskrit, but I'm told that the image that's used, that Lama Tarchin and others, classical, is emerging from the swamp. So it's a totally positive image. It doesn't have that negative connotation that this is going to hurt me and I'm going to have to be making some heroic effort to not do what I naturally want to do. No, instead, you're doing what your deeper self really wants to do. So you're emerging from the swamp of samsara. Instead of all this muck and mud like that, suddenly you're out of the water and it's clean. So what you're renouncing, you might say, is it's just this positive, again, facing your mind and understanding the teachings that the afflictions get you in trouble, and the agitated mind gets you in trouble automatically, or at least is limiting your experience, the whole kit and caboodle today. So it has to do with renouncing all the false ways of refuge that we seek. Instead, we're seeking refuge in Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, because that has outer meaning. As the Buddha is this figure that lived so long ago, the Dharma, the teachings that have come down, like in this book, and then the Sangha being the great realized bodhisattvas or the whole Buddhist community. But it has inner meaning too, and that's the Buddha is your awake nature. The Dharma is that awake nature being understood, and the Sangha is your entire body. So all of these things just help us, but the renunciation is basically emerging from the swamp. Instead of mucking around in the things that we normally do, we're changing habits, changing the mind. Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure. Okay. Where do we go? All right. So the second question is, how did the Buddha change and develop? For it is this development which, in one way or another, the subject of his philosophy. It is a question which has been of central concern to Buddhists, and it is one which the Buddha himself frequently answered. Sometimes he answered it directly by recounting part of his life. Elsewhere he answered it indirectly by stating that if one did X, then the following deleterious consequences would come. But if one did Y, then the consequences would be wholesome and conducive to liberation. Behind this lay the assumption that the Buddha knew this because he had witnessed the alternatives. He required of himself, as of his monks, adherence to one rule of evidence. Quote, that which you affirm must be that which you have realized, seen, known for yourself. Okay. Pounded out statement. Yeah. Right. Give Keen the mic again. We need the dragon voice.
I was asking if you need the dragon. Okay. Is that the pounded out statement where, you got to pound it out like it's gold or something?
Yeah. You have to work it out yourself. But this is also great safety because, it's not just accepting somebody else's opinion or whatever. It has to be one's own effort, experience in that. It does not follow from the autobiographical nature of the Buddha's philosophy, however, that an account of the Buddha alone would be adequate to explain it. For despite his taste for solitude, he was part of his society and its history. He lived amid great and decisive social and intellectual changes whose fruits he inherited and to whose further course he contributed substantially. His thought was revolutionary, but it was a revolution which had already been in the making for a long time. The image I have in mind is that of a wave of change which built up slowly over centuries, touching every aspect of the lives of the ancient Indians. The Buddha was elevated to the crest of this wave, and he enjoyed a wide view across human affairs. The problem is to assess how much of his vision he owed to his elevation, to his position in history, and to the work of his predecessors and contemporaries, and how much to the keenness of his own sight. And that's very much the professor talking. Supposedly, I think he's going to get into it in a little bit, but supposedly there is, historically, there was actually great social development taking place in northern India. This is all in the the banks of the Ganges, the drainage of the Ganges. There were cities being created where before there had been none, perhaps, or fewer. So there was a lot of like energy happening socially and economically. There was apparently much more economic activity with merchants going from one town to another. So yeah, all these things are interesting. And that process continued even past the Buddha's life. But of course, for the Buddhists, we don't make so much of that. But again, he's talking to a general audience. All right, it's probably a good place to stop because we have a next section is the sources. And yeah, that's a good place to stop on page 5. So anything else from anybody? Okay. So I'd encourage you to, if you have the book, to read ahead, and then we'll go through like this, discussing it. You'll get into more depths, obviously, in the Buddha's life and some of the questions that arose. It is interesting, though, because if you think of the amount of literature and stories on the Buddha's life, it's just amazing. And of course, this is very helpful. Narrative is so helpful for people, and stories, and it often speaks louder than just a conceptual, elucidation of a particular teaching. But with the Buddha, it's very much like that. He had 45 years of teaching, and there's so many illustrative stories. Scholars get into trying to time these things, and it's just impossible. They know some of the things. It does seem like he said, because there's such consistency in the different traditions as to his birth, renunciation, challenges, and then his awakening and his teaching. But of course, eventually they disagreed over how to interpret various teachings in that. But the Buddha's done a pretty good job of keeping it together, because usually those kinds of little differences, make huge fissures in a tradition or whatever. Something years ago, again, I'm dating myself, but it was when Richard Nixon was elected president. He had Henry Kissinger, who was this professor from Harvard, as his national security advisor. Yes, right. And then later, Kissinger became Secretary of State, and he replaced a Wall Street lawyer. Typically, Secretaries of State had been like Wall Street lawyers. And Kissinger was the first academic to have that position. And Kissinger made the statement that, people are wondering, it was just, kind of weird because they thought of that time, people could slam academics as being kind of like eggheads or unrealistic, living in an ivory tower, meaning that they weren't attached to reality. This is kind of a common thing in the 50s and 60s, still lingering for Nixon. But Kissinger said, somebody made the statement that, well, thing is that in academic departments, you get in tremendous debates over the tiniest little bits of minutia. And that Kissinger was a survivor of this, of being very powerfully arguing over little tiny things, and that this somehow resulted in academics coming to these practical positions. I don't know if that's true, but nonetheless, the detail that he's going to get into here, I think, will be helpful for us. Okay, any other questions? Anybody? Yeah. Wow. Let's do the dedication then. We dedicate the merit from this evening of questioning, listening, speaking, and reading to the liberation of all motherly sentient beings. May we plumb the depths of these teachings to make it our own, to habituate the mind, to realize the nature of the mind, and through that realization to lead all beings to Buddhahood. Okay.
Frank,
Yeah.
I just wondered. Hi. When they talk about the bodhisattvas, they say that, uh, like you were talking about a hair on the back of your hand,
Yeah.
but for a bodhisattva, that would be like a hair in their eye when they're looking at the suffering of somebody else, right?
Yeah.
It's unbearable for them. It hurts so much. So I was thinking, this is suffering, right? When these Buddhas look at the suffering of others, they are suffering. They're not personally involved with themselves, right? But isn't that suffering? Like you were saying that they don't suffer anymore, but
Yeah. Well, those are the two views of it, right? You can say that the bodhisattva is suffering in the sense that it's a subtle suffering, in the sense that it's kind of like, instead of this perfect samadhi, it's like there's some sort of agitation in the mind because they see the agitation of someone else's mind, and the motivation is always to calm those waves. So that's viewing at it in the perfection of wisdom kind of way, but then viewing at it from Yeshe or Jnana, the primordial wisdom, looking down, so to speak. It's like it's all just a big display. The bodhisattva is feeling no suffering at all, but he or she manifests as if they're motivated to do something because they're feeling some sort of agitation too. But rather, I think it's just totally spontaneous. Again, that Chinese poem example of it says it's like grabbing your pillow in the midst of the night. Somehow your head has gotten separated from the pillow. Something's just a little off. You could say that's suffering, but it's just natural. Just grab it. There's no thought of suffering. So it's just this flow that can't really be labeled as suffering anymore, but we label it as suffering because suffering beings can relate to it in that way. And so it's actually helpful. It's like they say, again, when we talk about the aspects of the Buddha, one, the complete vastness, the emptiness, the Dharmakaya, like space or the sky. But of course, it's a sky that has color. It's this blue tint. It's not just a nothingness. But then the Sambhogakaya, these beautiful cumulus clouds that are there. You can't touch them. They're still absolute, you might say. And yet by the fact that they have this subtle form, it still gives, for sentient beings, a greater appreciation of the vastness, because we have something to look at in form. But then the Nirmanakaya, said to be like the rain dropping from the clouds, benefiting everyone. But the Nirmanakaya is called the deceptive body of the Buddha. Because again, in ancient India, people could walk by and they didn't have a karmic connection. They just saw an old man sitting under a tree talking to a bunch of men and women who had shaved heads. It didn't make any sense. So it's deceptive because you can be misled by that appearance, but it's all up to you. But at the same time, this is how the Buddha appears to deluded beings. And hence there are methods by which they can have confidence. If you tell someone you see this kind of mistake in some of the modern nihilism, if you say, well, all these things can be deconstructed and it's just sort of, beyond. Next thing you know, people are doing all sorts of non-virtuous things and they're suffering everywhere, although they think they have some sort of elevated view. So rather, it's like Nagarjuna said, the relative teachings are actually more important because it's through the relative, through the conventional, that we come to the absolute, because those relative teachings are on our same vibe, our same level of vibration, you might say. So we can become one with those. And then, of course, we discover that there's something beyond those. In the Lankavatara Sutra, it says, it is, appearances are not what they seem, nor are they otherwise. So it's very skillful. It's very skillful, but excellent point, Roberta. Yeah.
thanks for explaining.
Yeah. Okay, we'll continue trudging through the dusts of ancient India. We don't mean next week, okay? Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, say that.
Yes. Oh, this is especially for our Canadian members.
Right.
that next Thursday we will not be meeting because it is Thanksgiving
The
here
US Thanksgiving.
in the U.S.
Oh, happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yours was some time ago, wasn't
Right,
it?
right,
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Let's stuff it.
right.
Okay, but on the other hand, on the 26th, the Sunday after Thanksgiving, Kempo will be on Zoom to give a teaching here. Okay, so we're arranging that. So, okay.
Put it down our calendar.
Subject
Yeah,
still
I think
to be
an
determined.
the email that went out today with the schedule, I just copied the Sunday one and changed Kembo's name, but I left September 19th on. It should be the 26th, so there'll be another email going out with a correction on there, but okay. Okay, so have a good week, everybody.
Good night, you.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
No, Lankavatara. Lankavatara, it means coming down into Lanka. So in India, Sri Lanka was offshore, and there are many jewels there. And some way back when it acquired this reputation, it became kind of mythic of this jewel land, like a Pure Land. You want to go there, or even in the self-liberation path, you wanted to go there. They said that our human birth is like going to Sri Lanka, and you're on a treasure island, and there are jewels all over just on the surface. But most people are just walking around, they're not paying attention to the jewels. And so they come home and they don't have any more money than when they left. Whereas if you're smart, doing Dharma, you'll be picking up the jewels, practicing virtue. So Lanka, yeah, Sri Lanka. Yeah, Lankavatara, entering into Lanka. Bodhicharya. Vajracharika. Yeah. And that's the problem, in talking to the Tibetans, if you get to wanting to talk to them about a sutra and that, the only thing we ever know are the Sanskrit names for these things, and they don't know that. Yeah, right. Right. It's like, whoa.